On most evenings, the Harrington Town Museum sat in the polite silence expected of a building that had once housed a minor Victorian baronet and never quite recovered its aristocratic stiffness. Tonight, however, the silence carried the flutter of genteel anticipation. It was the annual Quiet Treasures Evening, a title which promised very little and, by local consensus, reliably delivered slightly less. Ladies in soft wool coats and men whose jackets smelled faintly of pipe tobacco filed through the hall with the reverence of pilgrims queuing to see a moderately important relic. Harrington was a town that believed deeply in heritage, particularly other people's. The centerpiece of the evening was the unveiling of the Harrington family heirloom, the jewel of Harrington House, a name so imposing that most attendees forgot it was, in fact, a rather modest sapphire brooch mounted in a flourish of gold filigree. What the jewel lacked in grandeur, the family more than compensated for in historical embellishment. Lady Tabitha Harrington, a woman of such rigid posture that even her disapproval seemed to stand to attention, regarded the jewel as proof of a lineage that had once brushed shoulders lightly with royalty. At precisely 7:30, Lady Harrington made her entrance, gliding forward with the deliberate grace of one who expects applause. The crowd hushed. The museum's curator, Mr. Applecombe, who possessed the nervous temperament of a man perpetually surprised by doors, scurried ahead to prepare the display cabinet for the grand reveal. "Now," Lady Harrington declared, "let us admire the crowning symbol of my family's enduring stewardship." A small ripple of clucking agreement passed through the audience. Mr. Applecombe opened the polished glass case with exaggerated care. Inside, resting on a faded velvet tray, lay the jewel, its blue surface catching the light in a way that suggested it was doing its earnest best under the circumstances. Then he hesitated. The hesitation was small, perhaps no more than a fraction of a second, but within that pause lay the seed of an incident, or at least as close as Harrington came to one. "Is something amiss, Mr. Applecombe?" Lady Harrington asked, her tone suggesting that quite a lot could be amiss if he answered incorrectly. No, my lady, not at all. Merely an adjustment." Applecombe leaned closer. The audience leaned closer too, though several feet away. He reached a timid finger toward the jewel's velvet cradle, then stopped short, as if it might bite. To the untrained eye, the display appeared quite normal, but Applecombe's eyes, trained primarily in fretting, detected it. The velvet tray was askew, just slightly, perhaps an inch off center, enough to suggest that someone had lifted it, or nudged it, or, most scandalously of all, touched it. He swallowed. "The tray seems to have shifted." Lady Harrington inhaled sharply. An action better, suited to a gasp if she had been the sort of woman who gasped. "Shifted," she repeated, as though the word itself were a breach of protocol. A buzz of whispers began in the second row, led by Mrs. Parchment, whose talent for outrage was often compared, behind her back, to a finely tuned musical instrument. "Shifted?" she echoed loudly, ensuring that any nearby deafness was promptly cured. But who would touch such a thing? The answer, of course, could have been anyone who leaned too close, anyone tasked with cleaning it, or an errant draught. But these explanations were insufficiently dramatic for Harrington. Applecombe fumbled for composure. "It's nothing terribly concerning. I shall correct it." He reached in carefully and nudged the tray back to proper alignment. But the damage was done, not to the jewel, which continued to sit serenely, but to the collective imagination of the room. Eyes darted from face to face. Had someone tampered with the Harrington jewel? And more importantly, had they done so unseen? The mild commotion caught the attention of Inspector Purbright, who had been invited primarily to satisfy Lady Harrington's fondness for official presence. He stood at the edge of the hall with the patient expression of a man accustomed to observing human absurdities unfold at their natural pace. Purbright noted the misaligned velvet with a faint tilt of his head. It was, in truth, a trivial disturbance. Yet Harrington, like many towns with more history than action, possessed a remarkable capacity to inflate trivia into intrigue. Mr. Applecombe cleared his throat. "The jewel is unharmed. Perhaps the case was jostled earlier." Lady Harrington bristled. "My family heirloom is not in the habit of being jostled." The whispers intensified. Someone said, "thief." Someone else said, "attempt." A third person, who had misheard entirely, whispered "teeth," which caused brief confusion. Purbright strolled closer. "Lady Harrington," he said with polite warmth, "might I inquire whether anyone besides the curator had access to the cabinet today?" She turned to him, grateful for an authority figure onto whom she could redirect her indignation. "Certainly not. The museum staff are scrupulously vetted." This, Purbright suspected, meant they were known to be related to respectable people. Applecombe adjusted his glasses. "I did dust earlier, Inspector, but the tray was aligned then, I'm sure of it." "Of course," Purbright replied gently. "These things rarely shift themselves." Lady Harrington stiffened further, possibly achieving a new posture milestone. "Inspector, I trust you shall look into this?" "I shall make a few inquiries," he said smoothly. "It may be nothing, but reassurances never harmed anyone." A man near the back muttered, "Could have been Greethurst," referring to the visiting antiques appraiser. He had left the museum early, citing a prior engagement at the Harrington Arms. His exit had already been the subject of whispered speculation. Mrs. Parchment sniffed loudly. He had the look of a man with intentions. Purbright considered this. In his experience, everyone looked like that to Mrs. Parchment. He turned back to the display case. The jewel glinted placidly. The velvet tray sat perfectly straight once more. Yet Purbright's eyes rested not on the jewel, but on the faint, barely perceptible smudge on the inner glass, as though a finger had brushed it. And beneath that a trace of something floral. Lavender, unmistakably lavender. Purbright said nothing. He offered Lady Harrington a courteous nod, stepped back, and let the town's curiosity swell like a tide. It would wash up at his desk soon enough. The disturbance at Harrington House rippled outward with remarkable speed for something so small. By the following morning, the slight misalignment of a velvet tray had grown, through careful tending by the town's most seasoned conversational gardeners, into a full-bodied scandal, complete with implied motives, imagined threats, and at least one unconfirmed foreign conspiracy. Mrs. Parchment was, of course, first to broadcast the matter. She considered it her duty, or at the very least a charitable service to those who lacked the initiative to panic promptly. Standing at her front gate in a quilted coat the colour of boiled rhubarb, she delivered the previous evening's events to Reverend Utterbridge with all the solemnity of a witness at a high court trial. "It was deliberate, Reverend. One doesn't shift velvet by accident. Oh, Applecombe tried his best to pretend otherwise, but he's as transparent as custard. Someone's hands were on that jewel." Reverend Utterbridge, whose mild smile masked decades of spiritual diplomacy, nodded with grave patience. "And were these hands, do you suppose, possessed of criminal intent?" Mrs. Parchment leaned in. "Possessed of something, certainly. I saw a man loitering near the cabinet earlier, foreign-looking." Foreign-looking in Mrs. Parchment's taxonomy covered any man who was not born within auditory range of the Harrington church bells. The Reverend wisely let the description rest without encouragement. Across town, Councillor Froggart was offering an entirely different interpretation to anyone within hearing distance of his voice, which was unfortunately ample. He had installed himself at the window table of the Harrington Arms, where local men drank their mid-morning ales with the belief that starting early gave the day a decisive tone. Froggart thumped the table. "It's that antiques appraiser fellow, Greethurst." Man scuttled out of the museum like a rat with a guilty conscience. Mark my words, the tray didn't shift itself. His audience, composed of 3 retired railway workers and a man who claimed to be writing a memoir, nodded with the vague approval of men who had no idea what he was talking about but enjoyed the atmosphere of authority. "Appraisers always have a scheme," Froggart continued. "They pretend to examine an item, value it, all very proper, and then suddenly it turns up missing. Insurance scams, you see. Rampant. Practically a cottage industry. No one questioned Froggart's expertise in these matters, largely because he had none, which made his confidence all the more entertaining. Meanwhile, Mr. Biddicott, a retired postmaster, whose spectacles magnified his eyes into perpetual astonishment, contributed yet another version of events. He cornered 2 young mothers outside the bakery, blocking their escape with the efficiency of a man who had once sorted mail for a living. "I heard," he whispered, "from an extremely reputable source, my barber's cousin, that the jewel is a fake, has been for years. Lady Harrington is simply putting on a show." One of the women frowned. "But the police were there." "Exactly," Biddicott said triumphantly, "to protect the secret." The second woman, who had never seen a conspiracy theory she didn't find vaguely exciting, asked, "Then what shifted the tray?" "Why the vibrations?" he replied, vague and satisfied. "These old houses, terribly unstable." By late afternoon, Purbright had been exposed to no fewer than 6 contradictory accounts, each presented with the righteous confidence of absolute eyewitness truth. He took notes, though not of the details, those were uniformly unreliable, but of who insisted, who hinted, who exaggerated, and who asked carefully pointed questions. People, he had long observed, revealed their motives more readily in gossip than in confession. He strolled the high street with an unhurried pace, allowing the town's social machinery to clatter along beside him. A small-town rumour, he reflected, was much like a wind-up toy. Once set in motion, it bounced unpredictably from one surface to another until it struck something of real substance. His task was to listen for the faintest change in pitch, the subtle shift indicating the toy had collided with truth. At the grocer's, Mrs. Winchcombe beckoned him over with a flour-dusted hand. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice though no one was within earshot, "I heard you're investigating the jewel incident." Purbright offered the faintest inclination of his head. "Merely making inquiries?" "Well," she said, leaning closer, "it wasn't just the tray. Someone said the glass had a mark on it, a finger mark." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Someone?" She hesitated. "Mr. Fenimore, the museum trustee. He mentioned it while buying apples, said he was concerned about the integrity of the display." "Did he indeed?" Purbright murmured. Fenimore had been conspicuously nervous the previous evening, though nerves were not uncommon among those responsible for fragile objects. Still, the mention of a fingerprint, something Purbright had quietly noticed but not announced, was worth filing away. As he left the grocer's, he nearly collided with Lady Harrington herself, who marched toward him with the purposeful stride of a general advancing on an enemy trench. "Inspector," she declared, "I insist you reassure the townspeople that the situation is well in hand. These rumours are intolerable." "I shall do my best to calm unnecessary agitation," Purbright replied gently. "Though I suspect the townspeople find the matter invigorating." Her nostrils flared. They find chaos invigorating. That is precisely my objection." Purbright nodded sympathetically. "Chaos does have its enthusiastic admirers." Lady Harrington drew herself up. "I trust you will find whoever handled the jewel." "Of course," he said. "These small disturbances often reveal more than they conceal." She frowned at this ambiguous statement, but allowed it to pass. By early evening the rumours had reached such saturation that even the policeman manning the station telephone looked weary. Purbright returned to his office, set his hat upon the rack, and opened the slim file the incident currently occupied. Inside lay a single sheet of paper containing only a few notes. Misaligned tray, finger smudge on inner glass, scent, lavender, several people certain of culprit. None agree. He tapped his pen thoughtfully. What intrigued him wasn't the jewel nor even the possibility of attempted theft. It was the disproportionate reaction. Something so small had drawn out so many narratives, each one tailored to its teller's prejudices and fears. That, in Purbright's experience, usually meant someone had something to hide, though not necessarily the jewel. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint hum of the station. Harrington's elderly vultures were circling, tearing facts into fiction with admirable enthusiasm. Somewhere beneath their flapping speculation lay the truth. Purbright intended to find it, quietly, patiently, and without disturbing the feathers more than necessary. Morning fog had crept into Harrington like an uninvited but quietly obliging guest, softening the edges of buildings and muffling the usual shuffle of early traffic. Inspector Purbright stepped out of the station with his coat buttoned neatly and his thoughts arranged with equal order. The previous day's enthusiasm from the town's rumour-mongers had provided him with little in the way of certainty, yet it had added several interesting strands to the tapestry of possibilities. He walked toward Harrington House Museum, the fog curling around him like a polite but inquisitive companion. The building emerged slowly through the mist, tall windows glazed with night's condensation, the stone facade holding its usual air of dignity, tinged with mild disapproval. It was the kind of place that remembered better centuries. Mr. Applecombe was already inside, unlocking display cases with the trembling caution of someone who expected each hinge to explode. He jumped spectacularly when Purbright cleared his throat. "Oh, Inspector, you startled me." His glasses slipped down his nose, as if attempting escape. "Apologies," Purbright said gently. "Fog tends to muffle the approach of even the most deliberate footsteps." Applecombe managed a nervous laugh. "I didn't sleep very well, worrying about the jewel, or the tray, or everything, really." Purbright regarded him with quiet patience. "A small matter, Mr. Applecombe, but small matters sometimes point toward larger ones. I'd like to ask about museum access yesterday." "Yes, of course," Applecombe said, wringing his hands as though trying to dry them on invisible towels. "Staff only. Myself, Mrs. Loppington, and Mr. Fenimore. Oh, and the volunteer rota. Young Miss Penwick was dusting in the West Gallery around 5. "Penwick?" Purbright repeated. Applecombe nodded vigorously. "Shy girl, very diligent. Almost too diligent if such a thing exists." "Did she go near the jewel display?" "No," Applecombe insisted, too quickly, then paused. "Well, she might have. She dusts everything unless told specifically not to. Polishes too. I've had to remind her that museum pieces should look their age." Purbright made a note. "And Lady Harrington, did she view the display before the event?" Applecombe hesitated. "She peeked in, I suppose. She said she wanted to ensure we hadn't modernized anything. She was here in the afternoon for about 20 minutes. Purbright let that sit for a moment. Lady Harrington was not a woman who merely glanced at her heirloom. The idea that she had visited but not examined the case carefully seemed unlikely. "Anyone else?" he asked. The curator shook his head. "Well, the trustees met briefly. Fenimore was with them. He seemed anxious, but that's not unusual. He worries about budgets, or mice, or drafts. Hard to keep track." Purbright thanked him and moved on to the exhibit hall. The jewel waited in its newly aligned position, serene and innocent. The smudge on the glass had been cleaned, but Purbright could still recall the faint scent that had clung to it. Lavender. Unmistakable, distinct, and entirely out of place. He stepped back, folding his arms lightly. Lavender. A scent favoured by only a handful of people in Harrington, most of them elderly or inclined toward nostalgic cosmetics. It was not, however, the signature perfume of Lady Harrington. She preferred sharper florals that announced themselves before she entered a room. He moved toward the staff office, where he found Mrs. Loppington filling out forms with the determined energy of a woman who treated paperwork as a personal adversary. "Mrs. Loppington," Purbright began, "I understand you were present yesterday afternoon." She looked up sharply. "Present, yes. A body must be, if a body is paid to be. Applecombe needs someone to keep his mind on earthly matters. Otherwise he'd drift off into curator's heaven." "Did you notice anything unusual? Visitors lingering where they shouldn't?" She sniffed. "Only the appraiser, Greethurst, slick creature, eyes everywhere except where they ought to be, and he left rather abruptly." "So I've heard," Purbright said mildly. "Did he speak to anyone?" "Spoke to me," she said proudly, as though receiving a compliment from a scoundrel granted her a certain worldly prestige. "Asked about security, poked around the cabinet fittings. I told him he oughtn't tug at the hinges like that. Said it was standard assessment." "Did he touch the cabinet glass?" "Not that I saw, but I wasn't staring at him the whole time," she admitted grudgingly. Purbright thanked her and stepped outside again, where the fog was thinning into pale ribbons across the street. He found young Miss Penwick sweeping the path with small, swift strokes. She froze when he approached, like a rabbit, unsure whether it had been spotted. "Miss Penwick," he said with gentle calm, "I understand you were dusting in the museum yesterday." She nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, Inspector." "You're familiar with the jewel display?" "Yes, sir. Very beautiful. I only dust the base, never the glass. Mr. Applecombe says fingerprints are a menace." Purbright watched her carefully. She spoke with respectful clarity but avoided eye contact, directing her gaze instead at the broom bristles. "Did you notice anyone else near the cabinet?" She paused. "Mr. Fenimore walked past several times," she said slowly. "He seemed flustered, and he knocked over the small sign about the jewel's provenance. I picked it up for him." Purbright smiled lightly. "A helpful gesture." She nodded. "He smelled of lavender, sir." That caught him. "Lavender? My aunt bottles sachets," she said. "Mr. Fenimore buys them to keep moths out of the museum drawers. He dropped one once and it made the whole office smell." Purbright thanked her kindly and let her resume sweeping. He began walking back toward town through fog that had finally begun to lift. The museum, with its shuttered windows and careful displays, receded behind him like a stage after the actors had departed. Fenimore's nervous manner, his presence near the cabinet, his lavender sachets, the smudge on the glass, Applecombe's unease, Miss Penwick's observation. Individually, these details amounted to nothing more alarming than a misplaced herbal fragrance and a curator with fragile nerves. But Purbright had learned to trust such accumulations. A pattern was forming, not yet visible but stirring, faint as footfalls in fog. And somewhere within that pattern lay the first real thread. By the time Inspector Purbright returned to the station, The fog had thinned to a pale veil, and a different kind of cloud now awaited him indoors. Sergeant Malley stood beside Purbright's desk, wearing the triumphant expression of a man who believed he had solved a problem before lunchtime. "Inspector," Malley announced, "we've had 3 calls this morning naming the same suspect. Independent accounts, strongly worded." Purbright removed his gloves with deliberate care. 3 calls?" he repeated mildly. Harrington must be feeling brisk today. Malley consulted his notes. Councillor Froggatt, Mrs. Parchment, and Mr. Bidicott. Purbright paused. "Ah, a formidable triumvirate of certainty." Malley missed the undertone. "They all say it's that appraiser fellow, Greethurst." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "And what impressive evidence have they provided?" Malley brightened. "He left the museum early." Purbright waited, and, well, he asked about security and touched the cabinet fittings. "I see." Purbright set his gloves down and regarded the sergeant with kind patience. "So the essence of their claim is that Mr. Greethurst behaved like an appraiser?" Malley deflated slightly. "Well, yes, sir." Still, it was enough for some. Harrington had always found comfort in swift conclusions, particularly those involving outsiders. Greethurst was still lodging at the Harrington Arms, according to the message Malley had received, which meant he had not fled the county under cover of darkness, an act that would have greatly pleased Mrs. Parchment's narrative instincts. "I suppose," Purbright said, "we ought to speak with him." The Harrington Arms was quiet at midday, its bar scented with last night's ale, and the faint perfume of frying onions drifting from the kitchen. Greethurst sat at a corner table, his posture relaxed, but his expression betraying the wary alertness of someone who had spent enough time in towns like Harrington to recognize trouble by its footsteps. Purbright approached with a cordial nod. "Mr. Greethurst, Inspector Purbright, thank you for agreeing to speak with me." The appraiser straightened. "Of course, Inspector. I gather there's a commotion over that little jewel." "A modest commotion," Purbright agreed, taking the seat opposite. "No theft, but a disturbance. Some feel you may know something about it." Greethurst gave a soft scoff. "Let me guess, local dignitaries with very firm opinions." "Something along those lines." "Well," Greethurst said, folding his hands, "I examined the jewel yesterday as requested. Lovely piece. Not exceptional, but charming enough. After my evaluation, I left for the Arms, hardly fleeing the scene of a crime." Purbright studied him. "Mrs. Loppington mentioned you inspected the cabinet hinges." "A standard check," Greethurst replied smoothly. "Your museum's fittings are original, late Victorian. They've seen better decades. I merely noted it." "Did you touch the glass?" "Possibly brushed against it. Nothing more." He held Purbright's gaze. "Is this truly the basis of suspicion?" Purbright allowed a small smile. "To some, yes. But for myself, I am attempting to understand everyone's movements." "Well, you may note mine with complete accuracy," Greethurst said. "I arrived at 4, examined the piece, spoke with the curator and Mrs. Loppington, and left before the event. I didn't go near the cabinet again." His tone carried irritation, but of the controlled professional sort, more offended by incompetence than accusation. Purbright leaned back. "Have you any connection to the Harrington family?" "None whatsoever, unless professionally valuing their heirloom counts." Purbright considered him further. Greethurst's manner suggested a man used to suspicion and rumour but unconcerned by them. He was polished, alert, and not lacking in confidence. Yet confidence was not guilt, and guilt rarely displayed itself with such crisp assurance. "You left just after 4?" Purbright said. "Witnesses recall you seemed in a hurry." Greethurst sighed.
My hurry was toward a late lunch, Inspector. I'd been standing for 2 hours in a chilly hall while Mrs. Loppington explained the museum's heating problems with biblical intensity. Purbright accepted this with a quiet nod. "Tell me," he added, almost conversationally, "did you notice anyone else paying special attention to the display while you were there?" Greethurst hesitated. "Fenimore," he said finally. "The trustee." He hovered around the room, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. Seemed nervous. I assumed it was the usual committee politics. "Anything else?" "One small thing," Greethurst said, frowning thoughtfully. "The velvet tray. It looked worn. Old fabric is charming, but that piece seemed more worn than one would expect for such a treasured display, as though it had been handled frequently." Purbright's attention sharpened. "Handled recently?" Greethurst gave a vague gesture. "Perhaps. Hard to say, but yes, something about it felt unsettled." Purbright thanked him and rose to leave. Greethurst watched him with a blend of curiosity and defensiveness, as though bracing for the next wave of suspicion Harrington might generate. Outside, the air had warmed slightly. The last remnants of fog curled away into the hedgerows. Purbright walked back to town with measured steps. Greethurst had provided little to incriminate himself, but something he'd said stirred a small chord. The tray. Again the tray. Worn, handled, unsettled. It aligned with what Purbright already knew. Someone had indeed touched it. But the appraiser's observations carried no hint of concealment. If anything, they suggested someone else had been tampering with the display long before the evening's disturbance. At the station door, Mally intercepted him eagerly. "So, sir, was it him?" Purbright brushed a stray
thread from his sleeve. "Not at present, Sergeant." Mally looked crestfallen. "But everyone says—" "Yes," Purbright said kindly. "They do." He stepped past him, mind quietly assembling possibilities. Greethurst was an easy suspect. Too easy. Convenient suspects often were. Harrington had chosen him not because the evidence pointed his way, but because he fit the shape of a narrative the town liked to tell itself about strangers. No, Purbright thought as he settled behind his desk. The real answer lay not in the convenient suspect, but in the inconvenient inconsistencies, and one of them, faint though it was, smelled unmistakably of lavender. Purbright's afternoon promised to be uneventful until Mrs. Loppington telephoned the station with the strained urgency of someone reporting a fatality rather than a housekeeping discovery. Her message, delivered in a breathless stream of indignation, concerned something found beneath a chair in the museum's main hall. Purbright arrived 10 minutes later to find her standing rigidly beside the indicated chair, arms folded in a posture that suggested she was prepared to testify against the object in court. "It was tucked under the leg," she declared. "Deliberately hidden, I should think. Things don't crawl under chairs themselves." Purbright crouched, lifting the wooden chair gently. Beneath it lay a small, folded square of paper, creased at the edges as though it had been opened and closed more than once. He picked it up carefully. Mrs. Loppington hovered like an anxious hawk. "I haven't touched it," she assured him, though her air conveyed that she rather wished she had, if only to possess the scandal more directly. Purbright opened the paper. The handwriting inside was uneven and slightly slanted, confident in some strokes, cautious in others. A list occupied the page. Silvercomb, Harrington crest, miniature portrait circa 1820, pearl rosary, sapphire brooch the jewel, one item missing, not the jewel. He read the final line twice, not the jewel. He folded the paper thoughtfully. "Was anyone sitting here during the event?" Mrs. Loppington sniffed. "Half the town at one point or another. People treat these chairs as resting posts between bouts of chatter. I suppose anyone could have dropped it." Anyone, Purbright echoed softly. He slipped the note into an evidence sleeve and rose. "Tell me, Mrs. Loppington, does this handwriting look familiar?" She peered at it with the scrutiny of a woman evaluating a suitor for her granddaughter. "Not Lady Harrington's. Her script is very upright. This is slanted, untidy, more anxious, perhaps." "Mr. Fenimore?" "Oh, no, his handwriting is minuscule and precise, like that of someone terrified of wasting ink." Purbright almost smiled. "Volunteers? Trustees? Possibly Clara," Mrs. Loppington mused. "Lady Harrington's niece. She writes little lists to herself."
Constantly. But she wasn't present last night. Clara? Purbright asked lightly. I wasn't aware she participated in museum matters. She doesn't? Mrs. Loppington said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. But she has keys. Lady Harrington insists she understand the family responsibilities. Which is to say, she added tartly, she interferes. Purbright tucked that away for later. He next made for the curator's office, where Mr. Applecombe was conducting a valiant but doomed attempt to sort old catalogue cards into new drawers. He jumped again upon seeing the inspector. "I found something of interest," Purbright said, showing him the note without letting him touch it. Applecombe blinked at the page. Oh dear indeed. That's not from any museum inventory. Our lists use printed forms, not scraps." "The handwriting?" Purbright asked. Applecombe squinted. "Not mine, certainly, and not Mrs. Loppington's. Too delicate." He paused. "Perhaps Miss Penwick?" No, hers is rounded. This is sharp." "Do you recognize it at all?" Purbright pressed gently. Applecombe hesitated. "It resembles Mr. Fenimore's niece's writing. She used to leave him notes during committee meetings, but she moved away years ago, hardly relevant." Purbright inclined his head without comment. Applecombe, oblivious to the significance, returned anxiously to his disordered cards. Leaving the office, Purbright walked through the main hall again, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath his steps. The museum had a peculiar silence when empty, a faintly judgmental hush, as if the building resented the absence of visitors. The folded note weighed lightly in his pocket, but heavily in implication. A list of valuables, a missing item, and the curious reassurance, not the jewel. That line suggested foreknowledge. Whoever wrote it knew the jewel would attract attention, yet wanted to emphasize its irrelevance to their concern. A distraction, perhaps, or a message meant for someone else. He stepped outside, where the late afternoon sun diffused behind a thin veil of clouds. Harrington streets were calm, the earlier fog having surrendered entirely. He walked with measured pace toward the high street, considering possibilities. If Clara had keys, she could have accessed the museum at any time, but why leave a list beneath a chair during a public event, unless she hadn't meant to leave it at all? A dropped note was often more revealing than one intentionally delivered. The handwriting, sharp, angled, carried an urgency, as though the writer were cataloguing possessions under stress. The mention of a missing item pointed to theft, but one carefully concealed, not the jewel. Purbright reached the corner tobacconist where Mr. Bidicott was enthusiastically recounting a new conspiracy to a somewhat overwhelmed customer. Upon seeing the inspector, Bidicott brightened. "Inspector, I hear—"
"The investigation advances. Have you uncovered a smuggling ring? Foreign syndicate, perhaps?" "Nothing of the sort," Purbright said mildly, though he took mental note of the man's eagerness. Gossipers often stumbled upon accidental truths while embellishing fictions. He continued onward, letting the town's hum wash around him. Harrington thrived on performance, each resident rehearsing their preferred version of events. Somewhere amidst this theatre, someone had misplaced or hidden a very telling piece of paper. Back at the station, he placed the note on his desk and studied it again. The list itself seemed innocuous. Family heirlooms consistent with those displayed or stored in the museum's archives. But the final line tugged at him. Not the jewel, a reassurance, a warning, or perhaps a reminder to an accomplice. Their interest was not in the brooch. He leaned back, fingers steepled. This was the first object in the case that felt deliberately significant, not merely the byproduct of gossip or inconvenience. It had a purpose, even if that purpose remained obscured. And somewhere, someone would be worrying right now about whether it had been found. Purbright intended to let that worry ferment just long enough to coax truth from its surface. Purbright did not expect the note to stay quiet for long. Harrington possessed an uncanny instinct for sensing when something unsavory or even mildly unaligned hovered in its midst. True to form, by the next morning, the museum trustees had summoned him with the solemnity of a government inquiry. The meeting took place in the Harrington House Museum boardroom, where portraits of long-deceased Harringtons glowered down as if offended that modern scandals were being conducted beneath them. Mr. Fenimore was the first to greet him, his expression a careful mixture of anxiety and futile professionalism. His tie, patterned with small diagonal squares, was slightly askew, a detail Purbright noted with the same quiet attention he applied to smudged glass and lavender scents. "Inspector, we are deeply concerned," Fenimore began. "The museum's reputation, its legacy, is at stake. We must ensure that nothing improper persists." Purbright regarded him kindly. "Impropriety is a broad term, Mr. Fenimore. Perhaps you could be more specific." Fenimore blinked. "Well, the disturbance, the rumours, the possibilities." His voice wavered. "And now this business of an object being found." Mrs. Loppington, seated beside him like a majestic ship refusing to be overshadowed, cut in. "We must identify who left it. It undermines the integrity of our institution." Mr. Hargreaves, the treasurer, round-faced and perspiring despite the cool morning, added, "And potentially our finances, Inspector. We can't afford scandal. Donations shrink at the faintest whiff of impropriety." Purbright offered them all a patient smile. "The note is under review. For now, I simply need more context. Lady Harrington's niece, Clara, was mentioned. Does she often involve herself with museum affairs?" A ripple moved through the board, equal parts amusement and discomfort. "Clara," Mrs. Loppington said with a knowing sigh, "involves herself where she pleases. Lady Harrington insists the girl understands the duties of heritage, which in practice means Clara drifts in when she's bored." Hargreaves gave a sympathetic shake of his head. "Nice girl, but troubled. Unreliable in her commitments. She had a job in London, lasted 3 months, returned home without explanation." "And she has keys to the museum?" Purbright asked. "Technically," Fenimore said, shrinking a little. "Lady Harrington insisted. She thought Clara might, mature through responsibility." Purbright hid the small flicker of interest that sparked within him. "And did she?" The collective silence answered clearly enough. As he left the meeting, Purbright walked through the museum's corridor, where the morning light sifted through tall windows in pale ribbons. Miss Penwick, the shy volunteer, was polishing the banister with delicate circular motions. She straightened as he approached. "Good morning, Inspector." "Good morning. You were here again early?" Her cheeks coloured faintly. "I prefer the quiet hours. Fewer people." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Fenimore was here before me. He seemed agitated." "Agitated in what way?" Purbright asked gently. She twisted her cloth. "He kept checking drawers, opening and closing them."
And when he left, he didn't see me watching. He dropped something small into his pocket. A paper, I think. Purbright nodded, storing the detail. Thank you, Miss Penwick. Your observations are valuable. She gave a timid smile and resumed polishing, shoulders relaxing once he stepped away. Outside, the museum grounds were tended by the gardener, Mr. Latchley, a wiry man whose expression carried the long, suffering patience of someone accustomed to coaxing delicate plants into cooperation. He was raking errant leaves into a tidy pile when Purbright approached. "Inspector," Latchley said, touching his cap, "come about all the fuss, have you?" "Something like that," Purbright replied. "Were you here the evening of the event?" "Aye, setting lanterns along the path. Folk like a bit of atmosphere." Latchley leaned on his rake. "Saw someone inside, fiddling with the curtains in the main hall. Thought it odd. Curtains didn't need touching." "Who was it?" Latchley frowned. Couldn't tell from outside. Slim figure? Quick hands? Moved like they didn't want to be seen. Before or after the disturbance? "Before," he said promptly. "Maybe 10 minutes. Came from the east hallway." The east hallway, where the Harrington family artifacts were kept. Purbright felt a faint tightening of the threads. "And after the event?" he asked. Latchley shook his head. "Only saw Mr. Greethurst leaving in a hurry, and later Lady Harrington having words with young Clara. Not loud words, mind you, just sharp." Purbright looked up. "Clara was present?" "Oh, yes," Latchley said. "Slipped in near the end. Didn't make herself known." This contradicted Mrs. Loppington's assumption, and Purbright had long learned that assumptions in Harrington were almost always tenderly cultivated and entirely unreliable. Returning to town, Purbright walked with unhurried steps, letting the wind from the moors push faintly at his coat. The web around Harrington House was widening in small, intriguing increments. Clara's hidden presence, Fenimore's anxiety, a mysterious list noting a missing item, lavender scent, curtains adjusted for reasons no one could justify. These were not the movements of a single culprit, but of multiple people circling the same center, each for reasons of their own. As he neared the station, he passed the Harrington tea rooms, where Lady Harrington herself sat rigidly at a corner table, teacup raised like a scepter. Clara sat opposite her. The girl's posture was less composed. She held her cup with both hands, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn inward. Purbright slowed. Clara's face was pale, thoughtful, guilty perhaps, but not in the hardened sense. Rather the guilt of someone caught between obligations and missteps. Lady Harrington noticed Purbright and offered him a crisp nod. Clara did not look up. He continued on, not interrupting the moment. Some truths revealed themselves better when left unprovoked. Back at his desk, Purbright unfolded the found note once more. The handwriting, slanted sharp, could belong to a young woman, or someone trying to disguise their hand. The list was too tidy for a careless accident, too worried for a shopping reminder. One item missing, not the jewel. Something else had vanished, something someone knew the museum would not immediately notice. The jewel, then, was not the motive, but the distraction. The disturbance around it served a purpose, to hide another loss in its shadow. If so, then whoever wrote the note was either the thief or someone trying to warn against one. Either way, the web of Harrington House had widened enough that several threads now glinted with quiet significance. Purbright leaned back, exhaled softly, and waited for the next tug. The museum appeared perfectly still at night, its windows dark, its stone walls holding the last of the day's coolness. Yet stillness in Harrington was rarely absolute. It merely disguised activity taking place at the softer edges of respectability. Purbright suspected that the next movement in the case would not arrive through polite appointments or daytime interviews. It would come, instead, from someone unable to wait for morning. His suspicion proved accurate shortly after midnight when the station telephone rang with the shrill
insistence of something deeply offended at being ignored. Sergeant Malley answered, and his startled expression told Purbright all he needed to know before a single word was spoken. "Break in at the museum, sir." Applecomb's nearly beside himself. Purbright pulled on his coat and hat, the quiet of the hour settling around him like an old habit. The streets were empty save for a cat perched on a windowsill, its eyes catching the lamplight like twin lanterns. As Purbright approached the museum, he saw Applecomb fluttering near the entrance, wringing his hands in frantic loops. "Inspector, thank heavens! I heard a noise, a clatter inside the main hall. I wasn't here, of course. I was home, but the night warden telephoned me, and when he went to investigate, well, whoever it was had fled." "Fled with what?" Purbright asked calmly. "Nothing, apparently." Applecomb gestured helplessly. "But they left something behind." Purbright followed him into the museum. The main hall lights had been switched on, casting long beams across the polished floor. Near the display case of the Harrington jewel lay an object that stopped Purbright mid-step. A velvet tray, a brand-new velvet tray. He approached quietly, examining it without touching. The fabric was crisp, unfaded, unmarred by time. Its color, a deeper, richer blue than the existing tray, suggested it had not spent years under museum lighting. It was the twin of the original, but too perfect, too unaged. Applecomb hovered anxiously. "Inspector, this wasn't here yesterday. I would have noticed. The stitching alone, look at it." Purbright straightened. "Did the intruder left this?" "Yes. Or dropped it, or intended to replace the old one with it." Applecomb clutched his own elbows. But why? Nothing else was touched. Purbright moved to the display case. The jewel sat precisely where it had been that morning, glimmering demurely as though it had slept through the entire ordeal. The tray beneath it, the original, showed its familiar signs of fatigue, slight fraying at the edges, a faded patch where the jewel's base had rested for decades. "Did the intruder tamper with the case?" Purbright asked. Applecomb shook his head vigorously. "No marks, no forced hinges. The night warden saw a figure running from the east corridor but didn't give chase. We've already checked. The door wasn't broken. They must have had a key." A key. Purbright felt a small, almost imperceptible shift in the pattern forming in his mind. Clara had keys. Fenimore, of course, had keys. Trustees had them. Volunteers? No. Appraisers? Certainly not. "Show me where the figure was seen," he said. Applecomb led him into the east corridor, its floor still holding faint impressions of recent footsteps. The corridor was narrow, lined with framed sketches and informational plaques. A small window at the far end stood slightly open, allowing a draught to slip inside and rustle. The papers on a nearby desk. Purbright examined the sill. No signs of forced entry, though a faint smudge suggested someone had touched the frame, carelessly, hurriedly. Not lavender this time. Something earthy, like dust, brushed from a wooden drawer. "Was anything missing from this corridor?" Purbright asked. Applecomb performed a rapid, fretful inventory. "Not that I can tell. These rooms hold minor artifacts, ledgers, small trinkets, historical pamphlets. Nothing of significant value." Purbright let him fuss while he walked back toward the hall. The new tray remained exactly as they'd found it, placed, not dropped. Positioned, with an intention too tidy for panic. And yet the intruder had left without using it. Someone had planned a swap but lost nerve, or been interrupted. Purbright crouched closer, studying the stitching. Applecomb was right. It was flawless, too flawless. Whoever had obtained this tray knew precisely what they needed. Not just any velvet. The correct shade, the correct shape, the correct thickness. This was not improvised, it was prepared. But prepared for what? A substitution impossible to make in broad daylight? An attempt to correct the mishap of the misaligned tray before suspicions grew? He considered the note. One item missing, not the jewel. Someone had already taken something else. The jewel theft, if it was ever intended, might merely be a diversion, or a secondary goal too risky to complete the first time. The second attempt had nearly happened tonight. "Inspector," Applecombe said quietly, "do you think the jewel is in danger?" Purbright rose, dusting his hands. "No, I think it has already served its purpose." Applecombe blinked. "I don't follow." "You will," Purbright said gently, "when we identify what else in this museum someone feared being noticed missing." As they walked back through the hall, Purbright paused near the exit. The night warden stood dutifully nearby, a lantern in hand. "Did you see anything else?" Purbright asked him. "Anything small? Any sound beside the clatter?" The warden scratched his chin. "Just a sigh, sir." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "A sigh?" Yes, like someone realized something had gone wrong. That, Purbright thought, aligned perfectly. He stepped into the cold night, breath misting before him. The moon hung pale and indifferent over Harrington's rooftops, but its light did nothing to soften the tension tightening around the museum. The intruder had keys. The intruder had a reason. The intruder was not finished. And Purbright, with the soft certainty of experience, felt the case shift its weight at last toward clarity, though still hidden behind polite shadows and private motives waiting to surface. The morning after the break-in found Purbright in Miss Tevisham's tea rooms, a refuge favoured by those who appreciated quiet corners and water kettles that never once hurried. The inspector sat at his preferred table near the back, where steam drifted from a freshly poured cup, and the low murmur of conversation wove a gentle backdrop. It was a civilized setting in which to sort unruly thoughts. He stirred his tea once, then let the spoon rest, his mind already turning over the previous night's events. A midnight intrusion, a flawless velvet tray left behind, no theft, no forced entry, someone with a key, someone determined yet easily rattled. It suggested anxiety, not confidence, precision, but not practice. And the sigh the warden had heard, that detail lingered with him. It hadn't been the frustrated exhalation of a professional thwarted in a clever heist. It had been the soft human sound of someone realizing they had made a mistake that could no longer be undone. He sipped, letting the warmth settle. Human frailty, he reflected, caused more mischief in Harrington than malice ever did. Miss Teversham approached with a plate of scones. "You look thoughtful this morning, Inspector." "Just the ordinary tangle of human nature," he replied. She smiled kindly. "That's far trickier than any crime, I imagine." It was difficult to argue with that. Across the room, Lady Harrington and Clara were again seated together, just as they had been the day before. This time, their conversation was quieter, the atmosphere subdued. Lady Harrington maintained her usual rigid composure, but there were faint creases at her mouth that suggested strain. Clara, in contrast, looked paler than ever, her eyes fixed on the untouched cake before her. Purbright watched only long enough to note the tension between them. Clara's shoulders rose and fell in small, irregular breaths. Her fingers toyed nervously with a napkin. Lady Harrington's gaze was firm but not unkind. It held the weary authority of someone facing an unpleasant truth and trying to decide whether to confront it or hide it beneath propriety. The inspector turned back to his tea, Clara's hidden presence at the event. Her keys, her possible handwriting on the list. The missing item, one not immediately identified. And now, the midnight visitor. The night warden had described the intruder as slim, quick, uncertain. Clara matched the first two traits. Fenimore matched the third and fourth. Either could have panicked and fled. Yet the tray itself raised further questions. Why attempt to replace the old one? To mislead? To restore an original plan that had gone awry when the tray had been noticed misaligned? Or to prepare for a second, more discreet exchange? He lifted the cup again but paused mid-motion. There was another possibility, one that glimmered faintly beneath the surface of the facts. Perhaps the original tray held something more than the jewel. Something only noticeable on close inspection, something someone wanted to remove without drawing attention to the object itself. The note's final line whispered again, "One item missing." Not the jewel. He lowered the cup. If and item had already been taken days or weeks earlier, replacing the tray could have been part of concealing the absence. A worn tray could reveal marks, impressions, or faint outlines that a new tray would erase. Someone trying to prevent such a discovery might attempt a quiet switch, but last night's attempt had failed. Human motives, Purbright reflected, often emerged not from greed, but from fear. Fear of exposure, fear of disappointment, fear of being thought irresponsible. And fear made people behave with a misguided boldness that paradoxically exposed them more thoroughly than their original error ever would have. Clara, Lady Harrington's troubled niece, trying to navigate expectations she didn't want but bore anyway. Fenimore, anxious and whispering with shadows, fretting over budgets and responsibilities. Either could have been driven by such pressures. Either could have meddled out of desperation rather than deceit. Purbright reached for the small notebook in his coat and quietly turned to a page of neat, sparse notes. Fenimore seen near drawers, Clara present secretly, new tray prepared, scent of lavender, note, missing item, lavender. He tapped the edge of the page. That detail had been the first real clue, and it remained the most stubborn. Miss Penwick's remark about Fenimore's sachets explained its presence in principle, yet the smudge on the glass had carried a distinctly floral softness, more perfume than moth-deterrent. Clara, he recalled, wore a lavender scent, lighter, more refined. He let the thought settle without pursuing it immediately. A single clue rarely held meaning on its own. Context was what clarified a pattern. Lady Harrington rose to leave the tea-room. Clara followed, her steps slow and uncertain. At the door, the girl glanced back. Only a flicker, but her eyes met Purbright's for a brief, telling moment. There was something in them he recognized not as guilt, but as worry. The guarded look of someone who feared being discovered, not for a crime, but for a mistake she could not undo. When they were gone, Purbright remained in his seat a while longer, finishing the last of his tea. The morning had grown brighter outside. The fog that had haunted the earlier days of the investigation had finally lifted. Yet clarity, as always, came at its own pace. He rose, left a coin beside his empty cup, and stepped out into the sunshine with the measured composure of a man who knew the investigation had reached a quiet turning point. Human nature, like tea leaves, often settled into meaning only when left undisturbed long enough. And Purbright sensed that the next movement in this slow, unfolding pattern would come soon, prompted not by accusation, but by a simple question posed at precisely the right moment. For now, though, he allowed the morning to remain peaceful. The truth, he knew, would reveal itself when ready, and not before. Purbright set his plan in motion with the same calm precision he used in making tea. No haste, no theatrics, and not the slightest indication that anything unusual was afoot. He merely made 2 polite telephone calls, one to Clara Harrington, the other to Mr. Fenimore, inviting them to the museum for what he described as a brief, routine clarification. His tone, as always, gave nothing away. Both accepted, though each did so with a tremor in the voice that suggested very different varieties of dread. He ensured they would arrive 5 minutes apart, but occupy the same space soon after, a small reading room adjacent to the east corridor. It held a long table, narrow windows, and an atmosphere that encouraged honesty simply because lying felt improper in so austere a setting. Clara arrived first. She stepped into the room with hesitant movements, as though her shoes were uncertain of the floor. Her hands clutched each other nervously, and she wore the faint lavender perfume Purbright recognized from the glass-smudged days earlier. "Thank you for coming," Purbright said warmly. "I hope the early hour wasn't inconvenient." "No, Inspector," she murmured, though her eyes betrayed a night of troubled sleep. "You said it was a clarification?" "Just a few questions," he replied. "Nothing alarming?" She did not look reassured. He invited her to sit and adopt a more comfortable posture, though she perched on the edge of the chair as if preparing to flee at the slightest provocation. "Clara," he began gently, "you were present at the museum the evening of the disturbance. You did not announce yourself to your aunt. May I ask why?" She startled slightly. I only came to see the jewel. I thought it would be crowded, and I didn't want to be part of the fuss. I wasn't hiding." "No?" Purbright asked softly. Her shoulders tightened. "Not intentionally." He nodded, letting silence linger just long enough for unease to settle. "And the following night," he added mildly, "there was a break-in." Clara's breath caught, barely perceptible, but telling. Before she could speak, footsteps approached the door. "Ah," Purbright said lightly, "that will be Mr. Fenimore." Clara froze. The trustee entered the room with the twitchy formality of a man uncertain how to arrange his limbs. His tie was, once again, slightly crooked, and his hands bore the faint dusting of handling old drawers, an occupational hazard for which he always apologized. "Inspector, good morning," he said, then blinked in surprise upon seeing Clara. "Miss Harrington, I wasn't aware—" "Not to worry," Purbright said, motioning him to a seat opposite her. "I thought it efficient to speak with both of you together. Your recollections may help one another." Both sat with the stiffness of 2 people who would rather be anywhere else. Purbright folded his hands in a restful, almost leisurely way. "I'd like to begin with something found after the event," he said. "A small note," Clara's throat bobbed. Fenimore's fingers twitched. "A list," Purbright continued, laying the folded paper on the table without opening it. Several Harrington family items, one described as missing, and a line emphasizing that the jewel was not the item in question. Neither reached for it, but both stared at it as though it were something capable of detonating. Purbright allowed his gaze to drift between them, observant but not accusatory. "Miss Harrington," he said, "you write lists, I understand, frequently." Clara's voice wavered. "Yes, but I didn't leave that one, I didn't." Fenimore cleared his throat with an effortful rasp. "Inspector, surely we aren't to assume—" "I assume nothing," Purbright said pleasantly. "I merely listen and observe." He paused, letting the quiet stretch thin. "Last night," he added, "someone entered the museum with a new velvet tray. The intruder intended to replace the old one, either to conceal something or prepare for something yet to come. The attempt was interrupted." Clara's breathing became shallow. Fenimore's eyes flicked to her, then away. "I wonder," Purbright said, taking a sip from the tea he'd brought with him. "Who among you might have had both keys to the museum and knowledge of what was missing?" The silence that followed was brittle. Clara's fingers twisted in the fabric of her sleeve. Fenimore's foot tapped once before he remembered himself, and stilled it. Purbright set down his cup. "In the break-in," he continued, his tone still gentle, "the intruder left behind the new tray but mentioned its existence to no one. Curiously, this morning, when I questioned a few individuals, someone referenced it." This was the heart of the trap, though he did not reveal which detail he meant. Fenimore stiffened visibly. Clara blinked rapidly, confusion mingling with fear. Purbright looked directly at the trustee. "Mr. Fenimore, you told someone that the tray left last night was new and unfaded, but I had not shared that information publicly." The colour drained from Fenimore's face like ink seeping from paper. I misspoke," he stammered. "I assumed—" Purbright raised a mild eyebrow. "Assumed or knew?" Clara turned sharply toward him. "Mr. Fenimore?" The man floundered. "It wasn't theft, no, never theft. I wasn't stealing anything. I was trying to put something back." Clara inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. Purbright gave no sign of triumph, only patient expectation. "Go on." Fenimore sagged forward. "Clara came to me weeks ago. She said she'd misplaced something from the archives. Something her aunt trusted her with. She panicked. I thought I could help. I thought if I fixed the tray, swapped it quietly, no one would notice the missing impression." Clara whispered, "I didn't ask him to do that." "You didn't need to," Fenimore said miserably. "You were terrified." Purbright leaned back, concluding the trap had sprung as softly as intended. No shouting, no dramatic confession. Just two people caught in the slow collapse of a shared mistake. Clara closed her eyes. "I lost the miniature portrait," she whispered. "The one from 1820. It fell. The frame broke. I panicked and put it aside to repair it, but then I misplaced it. I didn't want Aunt Tabitha to know." "And so," Purbright said quietly, "you wrote the list." She nodded, tears finally gathering. "Yes. I wrote it to remind myself what needed returning." Fenimore buried his face in his hands. "And I thought, if I replaced the tray, no one would see the mark the portrait's frame had left on the velvet. I only wanted to spare her the embarrassment." Purbright allowed a long breath to fill the small room. Human frailty, as usual, was the culprit, and his gentle trap had revealed precisely the kind he expected. Now all that remained was the truth itself, and the final, calm unfolding waiting in the next chapter. Lady Harrington's drawing-room had the air of a chamber that had never once tolerated disorder. Everything, from the porcelain dogs on the mantelpiece to the immaculate fringes of the carpet, sat with an almost territorial precision. It was, Purbright reflected, an ideal place for uncomfortable truths. Such rooms seemed to demand them. Clara sat stiffly on a small fauteuil to the left of the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Fenimore occupied a chair several feet away, as though the distance might somehow dilute the gravity of his involvement. Lady Harrington stood by the window, spine straight, fingers curled lightly around a lace handkerchief that she had not used, but clearly anticipated needing. Purbright, with the quiet composure of someone who had delivered far more awkward explanations in far less elegant rooms, settled himself in an upright chair near the centre. "Thank you all for agreeing to meet," he began, voice gentle but unmistakably steering. "I believe clarity will do more for your peace of mind than continued speculation." Lady Harrington gave a curt nod. Clara did not lift her gaze. Fenimore made a faint sound that might have been assent or merely nerves negotiating for space inside his throat. Purbright placed a small, cloth-wrapped object on the table between them, though he did not yet reveal its contents. "Let us begin with the note found beneath the museum chair," he said. A list of Harrington valuables written hurriedly, anxiously, and the curious assurance that the jewel was not the missing item. Lady Harrington turned sharply toward Clara. "I suppose we may finally hear why my heirlooms were being listed like groceries?" Clara managed a small, strained breath. "It was only for myself. I didn't mean anyone else to see it." Purbright continued before the rebuke could deepen. "The handwriting
Is yours, Miss Harrington. You acknowledged as much. The note referred to a missing object, one not immediately obvious to the museum, a miniature portrait from the early 19th century. Lady Harrington stiffened, but said nothing. Purbright lifted the cloth. Beneath it lay the broken frame of the tiny portrait, its gilding cracked at two corners, the glass chipped. The painted face of a stern gentleman peered out through the damage as though personally affronted by the indignities of recent weeks. Lady Harrington inhaled sharply. "My great-great-uncle's likeness," she murmured. "Where did you find it?" "In the bottom drawer of the East Corridor cabinet," Purbright said, "buried beneath invoices and pamphlets. Miss Penwick discovered it this morning but was too frightened to say anything until the curator coaxed it out of her." Clara shut her eyes. "It fell," she whispered. "I was trying to clean a smudge on the glass, the portrait's glass, not the display case, and it slipped. The frame cracked. I didn't know how to tell you." She looked desperately at her aunt. "I was ashamed." Lady Harrington's mouth pinched, but Purbright gently interrupted before familial disappointment could overwhelm the room. "There was no ill intent," he said, "only fear of consequences. And in that fear, Miss Harrington misplaced the portrait while attempting to repair it." Fenimore shifted miserably. "And I tried to undo the damage," he confessed. "Clara told me about the accident. I thought the old velvet tray would reveal the missing impression the portrait had left. The museum would discover the absence, so I ordered a replacement tray. I meant to switch them quietly before anyone noticed." "Which," Purbright added, "is why you entered the museum at midnight. You intended to use the new tray to conceal evidence of the prior damage." Fenimore nodded, his face pale. "I'm not proud of it." Lady Harrington drew herself up. "But why involve yourself at all, Mr. Fenimore? The matter was strictly between Clara and me." Purbright answered for him. "Because the two of them feared disappointing you more than they feared impropriety. That is often the root of these small catastrophes." Clara opened her eyes. "I didn't want to be the cause of trouble. I've caused enough already." Lady Harrington's hand tightened on the lace handkerchief. "If you had simply told me—" "I know," Clara whispered, lowering her head. "I should have." Purbright allowed the silence to settle, gentle but firm. The rhythm of the truth had reached the point where it could be spoken plainly. "As for the jewel itself," he continued, "it was never in danger. The disturbance during the Quiet Treasures evening was merely the result of Mr. Fenimore attempting to realign the tray before the unveiling. The misalignment you noticed, Lady Harrington, was unintentional." Lady Harrington's
brows lifted sharply. "Mr. Fenimore, you touched the display?" Fenimore gave a small, stricken nod. "Very foolish," Purbright said softly, "but done out of panic, not mischief. The scent of lavender on the display glass came from the sachets he uses in the archive drawers. Clara's perfume shares the note, which complicated matters, but the lingering trace in the East Corridor matched the drawer sachets precisely." Clara turned toward Fenimore with startled sympathy. "I didn't know you were trying to help me that much." "I shouldn't have," he said. "It was improper." Lady Harrington, after a long moment, lowered herself into the armchair opposite the group. The faint rigidity in her posture softened, barely but perceptibly. "I find," she said slowly, "that honesty, however belated, is preferable to deceit prolonged." Her gaze passed from Clara to Fenimore, and then to the broken portrait. "This is unfortunate. But the jewel remains untouched, and the museum's security has not been irreparably compromised." Purbright inclined his head. "No scandal need arise. With your permission, I will simply note the matter as an internal mishandling, nothing more." Clara's eyes filled with quiet relief. Fenimore looked ready to weep outright. Lady Harrington exhaled, a long, measured breath, as though releasing weeks of contained disappointment. "Very well, let the matter rest here. But Clara," she added, her tone neither harsh nor gentle, "we shall discuss your responsibilities at home." Clara nodded meekly. Purbright rose. "Thank you for your cooperation. I believe all necessary truths have been aired." And in the dignified hush of the drawing-room, the final tension unknotted itself, calmly, without melodrama, exactly as Purbright preferred. The next morning, Harrington greeted the world with its usual mixture of tidy routines and unspoken curiosities. Whatever faint tremor the jewel incident had caused was already smoothing itself over, as small town disturbances often did, once their sharpest edges had been filed down by explanation. Inspector Purbright walked through the high street at an unhurried pace, taking in the familiar rhythm. The postman chatting with Mrs. Winchcombe outside the bakery, Mr. Biddicott insisting he had suspected the culprit all along, and Councillor Frogart lamenting the lack of real crime in Harrington, while secretly grateful none had appeared. The museum, at least, was Newfoundly peaceful. Applecombe greeted Purbright with a flutter of relief. The broken portrait had been repaired by a specialist recommended by Greethurst, who, despite having been the favoured suspect of half the town, proved gracious and unexpectedly skilled in matters of restoration. "It will look as good as new," Applecombe said, brimming with a pride that wasn't entirely his own. "Lady Harrington has already approved the repair." "And Clara?" Purbright asked. Applecombe straightened his spectacles. "She visited early this morning. Apologized repeatedly. Left flowers for Miss Penwick, of all people. Very sweet gesture." Purbright smiled faintly. "Guilt often searches for gentler hosts." Indeed, Clara seemed much lighter when Purbright saw her later near the churchyard gate. She offered him a soft, sincere thank you, nothing elaborate, just the kind that came from someone who had thought heavily and slept lightly, and now breathed more freely. "Aunt Tabitha isn't furious," she said quietly, almost surprised. "She said accidents happen, and that responsibility is not the same as perfection." Purbright inclined his head. "A wise observation." Clara gave a small, grateful smile and walked on, her steps less hesitant than before. As for Fenimore, he appeared at the station shortly after noon, hands clasped behind his back, with a humility that seemed to shrink him slightly. "I've offered my resignation to the board," he said. "Not because I wish to abandon my duties, but because I've neglected them by trying too hard to conceal a mistake." Purbright regarded him with a gentle understanding. "Sometimes," he said, "the desire to repair discreetly creates more disorder than the original damage." Fenimore gave a rueful nod. "Lady Harrington refused the resignation, if you can imagine. Said the museum requires people who care too much, rather than those who care too little. I'm not quite sure if that was a compliment." "In Harrington," Purbright said, "it is." Fenimore left with visible relief, shoulders lighter, as though guilt had been replaced with a manageable sense of duty. By late afternoon, the museum trustees had already begun drafting improved security procedures that would almost certainly be ignored the moment they proved inconvenient. Harrington had its own way of maintaining order, a balance of vigilance, oversight, and the collective assumption that nothing truly disastrous would ever occur within its borders. It was a balance Purbright respected. The town did not thrive on lawlessness. It thrived on the quiet certainty that even its missteps could be set right with a mixture of honesty and civility. Back at the station, Purbright settled behind his desk, the final notes of the case before him. He read them once more, a misaligned tray, a lavender smudge, a worried niece, a well-intentioned trustee, and a miniature portrait that had endured 2 centuries only to suffer indignity at human hands. All woven into a pattern that had seemed far more sinister from a distance than it proved upon close inspection. Sergeant Malley appeared at the door. "All sorted, sir?" "Quite sorted," Purbright replied. "No charges, no formal report." "A brief summary," Purbright said, "and a recommendation that certain drawers be closed with more care. That will suffice." Malley nodded, slightly disappointed. Harrington's dramas, he felt, always ended before they could become properly dramatic. When he left, Purbright leaned back, letting the quiet of the room settle. Outside, the low autumn sun cast long shadows across the pavement, shadows softened by the golden warmth that only late afternoon could provide. Small-town life, he reflected, did not rely on the absence of secrets, but on their careful management. People hid things not out of malice, but out of embarrassment, fear of judgment, or simple human imperfection, and so long as those secrets sought the light with gentle encouragement, equilibrium returned easily enough. He closed the file with deliberate calm. Another case concluded. No villains, no grand conspiracies, only the timeless choreography of human frailty stepping carefully around expectation. Purbright reached for his pen, the soft scratch of paperwork beginning once more. Outside, Harrington resumed its quiet, dignified hum, as though the jewel and its misaligned tray had never troubled it at all,